Burnout is a condition that impacts a lot of us in modern society. It can be confusing and difficult to work with, and it can be recurring. How do we get out of it? Well, my guest today has some clear and fantastic, and most importantly, research based answers. We'll talk about burnout from an organizational level as well as from an individual level, and there's a lot of wisdom in this interview. Well, welcome everybody. Today I'm delighted to talk to Tanya Tarr. Tanya Tarr is a behavioral scientist who studies how people make choices and how that impacts and motivates change. She is an internationally recognized speaker, a master trainer, and a certified coach, a columnist and senior contributor with Forbes. She is a top influential voice on Twitter with regard to diversity and equality. She's spoken at many important conferences: South by Southwest, Women in E-Discovery, Disrupt HR, Women and Research, and others. Tanya spent 2 decades in progressive politics, working with data and with individuals to influence voting behavior and issue persuasion. And as a coach and facilitator, she's worked with thousands of individuals, including military families, politicians, executives, all over the globe, and she helps them with topics as diverse as negotiation skills, communication skills, burnout, imposter syndrome, and others. Tanya, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about burnout today. So first, let's define burnout.
So I've been writing a lot about burnout, occupational burnout. First of all, occupational burnout. It's not a health condition. It is a dynamic that a lot of people are experiencing, particularly right now. And I think the general kind of way that we define it is a feeling of being disconnected, exhaustion, or numbness at work as a result of overwork. And I really look to the seminal research of Dr. Christina Maslach. She developed the Maslach Index. And was the first to really do this kind of research. And so she talks about 3 kind of key issues to think about, being sort of your effectiveness or lack of effectiveness at work, feeling depersonalization or compassion fatigue, feeling unmotivated, and feeling numb or feeling anger, and just feeling wrung out. It's exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. That's the third one. And so, what's interesting is that there's been a lot of research over the years, over the intervening sort of 30 years, now 40 years. And there's a recent new burnout index called the Sydney Burnout Measure that has just gotten published. And what those 2 researchers found is that a couple of things that are interesting. So the first is that burnout is not just something that organizations create. So Dr. Maslach pointed out and made it clear that organizations create the conditions of burnout, but burnout is experienced by the individual, right? And what the Sydney measure and those researchers, and we'll definitely put it in the liner notes. I'll send you all the links. I'm blanking on their names right now because brain fog, because pandemic. Anyway, but what those researchers in Australia found was that a couple of interesting things. So the first is that self-isolating. Now I know a lot of us are in lockdown, so because of the pandemic, but intentionally withdrawing and engaging in in self-isolation is also a symptom of burnout. And so that's a little bit new. And then the other thing that they found out is that extrinsic factors actually make and have an impact. So burnout can be exacerbated by the pandemic, climate change, and some of the issues around like race that we're dealing with right now, right? So these are all external factors that are exacerbating the situation. That study also found that you can be depressed, you can have a localized depressive episode with all of these different things overlapping, right? But that depression is not a condition of burnout. And I think the same is true. Oh yeah. Well, one last thing too is that I think the same is true for inflammation. and some health issues, that I think we're going to get better understanding that too. So that I think it's useful to know sometimes you can have certain conditions, but they are not necessarily indicative that burnout is present. So they're associative, but not sort of causative.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually really important because in some way labels matter, right? And if somebody gets labeled as depressed, it's a very different label. And then also course of treatment or action than, for example, burnout, which, as you say, has these external factors that can play a prominent role. You mentioned the pandemic. Mentioning or talking about that, I'm wondering, is burnout more prevalent among certain groups? So some people or groups more susceptible to it?
I got to do a really good interview with Dr. Mandy O'Neill at George Mason University, and I was asking her opinion. And she's a well-being expert and an academic and just brilliant. She does a lot around workplace wellness. And there was a poll that came out that said that women were experiencing more burnout than men. On its face, you'd be like, this makes a lot of sense. And I think people of color, marginalized folks who are heavily impacted by the pandemic and by climate change probably also experience a higher level of burnout, because burnout is really the misalignment, right? Like burnout happens when we feel we don't have control, or when we continue to do something without a sort of deadline where it's prolonged. And we burn out because we keep trying to do something without any purchase, engagement, traction, right? Or we can't see a way out. But what I found so interesting about what Dr. O'Neill's perspective was that, yes, these type of polling results seem to ring true because women in particular have had to do so much more during the pandemic than men. They've got to find ways, to stay employed. Maybe they're working remotely, but then their kids are in the house and they have to take care of the kids, and they also have to be a homeschooler. And then maybe their partner is not helping as much as they would like. Although I've also seen lots of stories where it's actually easier on households because both parents are helping out. But that aside, Dr. O'Neill had this very interesting insight, which is these results may be true, but also men, and particularly white men, do not have the proper tools and have not been socialized to be self-reflective in ways that would help them recognize if they were burnt out or not. If not burnout, they feel almost like a survivor guilt.
So touching on the sense of control, right? When I work with clients, I often differentiate between control over external circumstances, right? And then an internal sense of control, emotion regulation, thoughts, and so on. So with burnout, what you're saying, really, there is a high impact of these external factors. So where do we begin to address it?
It's overwhelming. So we have this very interesting conundrum in front of us, right? We understand some level of what is causing the harm, but like Dr. Maslow says, organizations create burnout, but burnout's experienced by the individual. There's a lot of instinct to want to blame, and it's not actually helpful. And what needs to happen is that individuals need to do what they can to self-stabilize. At the same time, organizations need to change, and organizations are made out of people. So we've got this like simultaneous problem we've got to solve, right? The organizations have to change and adapt, and the individuals have to change and adapt. And I think the other piece of this too, particularly as I'm actually, out there in the field doing some of this restorative work, is that when I present it as, it's not so much of we're recovering from burnout, so much as that there are cycles of burnout and recovery. And that actually what we're trying to do is find more sustainable ways of living, right? Like burnout is the result of not living sustainably. And so that's a reframe of solving the same problem. So I just launched a class and it sold out pretty quickly, which was exciting, but it's almost entirely high performing women. Like half of them are executives. Like, like they're shark. I call them Sharky ladies. I love them. They're my favorite, Sharky ladies. but they're real badasses. They're doing amazing stuff out in the world. And their instinct is always to be like, I can't wait to learn stuff so I can take it back to my team, or I can take it back to my family. And I have to keep telling them, like, no, the purpose of this class is for the individual to focus in on her needs. So it is laudable that you want to pass on good information. But as your instructor, I am here to remind you that the focus of this class is actually for you to do that work. Because I feel like there are lots of different ways we can try to solve this problem, but everything's so overwhelming that actually the first step for anyone experiencing burnout is to take a step, take a breath, and then first focus on their limits, right? So I think a lot of burnout happens because we're overextending. And we don't necessarily get socialized to think about limits first. So the first thing is to think about limits. And the second thing is to trust that when you create really positive personal ecology and you start making some of those sustainable choices, that actually it gives permission for everyone around you to do the same. And that by extension will help transform organizations. There's also organizational policies that need to happen, right? It's not just individuals, but these things actually have to happen simultaneously. And I don't know that we're particularly good at doing those kind of things as a species, but this is the challenge in front of us.
What are the barriers now, talking on an individual level, that stand in the way? Because most of us know that, right? We know we need to take a break. We know we need to have limits and say no on occasion. But from a behavioral perspective, perhaps, what stands in the way?
It's not so much saying no. So what I teach in the class is I actually call them your functional limits. I can get super nerdy with you, I know, because we're both scientists. Listen, like, there's something called bounded rationality, right? In cognitive science, there's this concept of bounded rationality. Dr. Herbert Simon developed this concept, which is that human beings, well, it depends on who you read. Sometimes you read this philosophy and it's actually kind of neat and makes us sound like we're stupid, but as human beings, which may or may not be true. But what I take away from this concept of bounded rationality is that human beings make decisions better when we are presented with smaller numbers of objects, right? So we actually do better, and you know this from market research, right? We do better if we are presented with 3 to 5 options, maybe 7 on the outside, but anything more than that is overwhelming. And we tend to, it's called satisficing. So we'll choose the best out of what's available. But I also think that there's an upside to this, to know that we do better when we have usually like a time constraint will actually drive behavior. But we don't do a good job. We overeat. We overextend because we don't think about, the number of hours that we have, the amount of attention spans that we actually have. And so I think people tend to think of limitations as negative, but I actually think limitations are great because it lightens the cognitive load because it's easier to make decisions. And it also drives behavior. So behavior is driven by emotions, no question. And sometimes we're inspired to do remarkable things. I would say most of the time we change our behavior because of irritation. Unfortunately, just like mild irritation, particularly when it comes to burnout, a lot of it is driven by clock management or bad clock management or no clock management or project management. And so, one thing is to put stuff on the calendar, but the other thing is to be more realistic about what your calendar looks like. But also that, like, you really have to think about your functional limits. Not so much, people talk about boundaries all the time, and they're mostly talking about like say no or like, create your boundary. And it's a sort of emotion. I think the way in context, it feels like they're talking about emotional boundaries or possibly saying yes to a task. I'm saying you got to look at it the other way around, which is, what is your upper limit of what you can actually do? Right? and actually pay attention to that, and actually let that actually do a much more clear job of helping you navigate and helping you make decisions during the day.
I'm so intrigued by this idea of functional limits. And so if I understand you correctly, what you're saying, we kind of, with that, create our own limits, and those limits then drive better choices, better behavior.
Yes. So, and actually it's functional limits based on reflecting on your past experiences, right? So, and spending some time. And so this is also, by the way, this is also a reason why understanding burnout and then also creating useful interventions is tricky, because everyone's burnout situation is highly idiosyncratic and very dynamic. It's always changing, right? And you can revisit it. There's a high instance of relapse. So so methods can be tricky to promote, right? Because how do you do that? We also are not usually set up in a way where we're teaching good heuristic methods or frameworks. Can I rant a little bit? Can I criticize? Can I be a little critical?
Go for it. Absolutely. Don't hold back.
All right. Well, this was my hesitation in doing anything with regard to wellness, is that because we were talking earlier, but I got certified as a health coach in 2015. And part of my hesitation and why I didn't stand up a health coaching practice was because this is only 6 years ago, but even before and even currently, a lot of the times it's driven by personality. It's like cult of personality, right? So somebody does something super dramatic, right? They lose 1,000 pounds, or they grow a third leg or something, right? Like they do something really dramatic. And then they build this massive audience on social media, and then they become a coach, and then they sell you whatever products so that you can become just like them. And the issue with burnout is that doesn't work. It really doesn't, because unless you are the exact mirror demographic of that individual, or you're particularly, motivated to lose 1,000 pounds or grow a third leg, like not everybody wants to do that. So this makes it tricky. So this is what has guided what I'm developing as a method, which is more about, can we teach people the proper framework and good science around habit formation and around time management, which is super boring, but really important. And also to take it from the perspective of, okay, let's do some inventory and self-assessment. Like, what are the maximum number of days that I can work in a row before I start wanting to smash things, right? And so this is actually what I'm teaching now, right? Is help walk people through that, find out what are your functional boundaries, and it's understanding, how many days you're working in succession, and how many hours a day are you working, and how much time are you spending client facing, and sort of doing that data collection on oneself. And then, as because you're a therapist, emotions are signals.
Yeah.
So when you rage out or you're super numb, but particularly the anger piece of it, is because you've crossed over one of those functional boundaries. That's the signal. It's just like a car, these fancy newer cars, when you sort of drive and drift. Yeah. And it beeps, right? So your functional boundaries are your bright yellow lines. If you figure out what your bright yellow lines are, you start figuring out those upper bound limits, and then you can use them like yellow lanes on a road. Those lines are there to keep you safe.
And it's interesting because if you create your own limits, that takes us back to a sense of power and control, right?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
Us creating in that play, that's so important. The other thing I wanted to follow up on, you've talked about emotion, and I'm totally with you. They are signals. They're not good or bad. They're just signals. And we've talked about behavior and habits. What about thoughts? So when I work with clients, often I work on these looping, self-defeating beliefs that are often very old and very deeply rooted, like I'm not good enough, I don't do enough, I'm bad, right? So does that play a role in burnout? And if yes, how do you work with it?
That's a great question. This isn't a direct answer to your question, but kind of, again, because my whole thing is I teach people frameworks they can apply and figure out how this, addresses what their needs are. Well, and on the concept of self-talk, I could talk a whole lot about that. This is a whole other context, but repetition matters. And actually talking back to that negative voice matters. I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy, and I saw a cognitive behavioral therapist for almost a decade. I'm a big fan. The other framework that I teach is this concept of the 4 rooms, which is evidently an Indian axiom or adage that Rumer Godden, I think is how you say her last name. She's a British writer. But she wrote about how, like, everyone who lives a full life, they live in a house with 4 rooms: emotional or physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Right. I think Gretchen Rubin wrote about it in one of her books too. She wrote about happiness. I think it's a really great framework because it's like there are 4 boxes you can check off. Right. And so, like, are you spending time paying attention to your physical health? Are you paying attention to your mental health? Are you paying attention to your emotional health? And are you paying attention to your spiritual or your creative health? Right. During my recovery and learning how to manage symptoms of inflammation in particular, really applying this 4-room concept to my life, it was like I had over-indexed on the mental room. Everything was about career. And then I was not paying attention to my physical room. And I knew I had a spiritual room, and I would go to it every once in a while. I had no idea there was an emotional room. There's an emotional room. Who knew? Who knew there was even an emotional? So, but I think for me, it's the emotional room is a lot about just using it as very important signals and feedback. I also think I have noticed that when I'm feeling a renewed sense of purpose, and when I feel like when I have movement, especially in work related stuff, when I feel like there's movement, then all of a sudden, and I'm deeply introverted, but then I feel like, oh, I want to talk to people. I all of a sudden feel this extroversion because I'm feeling actually optimistic about what's going on.
I love this concept, and going back again to this idea of the emotional room. One of the things that comes to mind for me is how really disconnected we are from our emotions, because we're disconnected from our bodies, right? We're sort of in a disembodied society. And you even mentioned it. You lived in the mental room. I did for many, many years or decades, right? It's all cognition, all right, mind over matter, and nothing exists down here. But emotions happen in the body. So how do we find our way back? What are some things you've done? And I know you're into martial arts, so I wonder if that plays a role, but what else can we do to get more in touch with our emotions, our body?
I think as a general, whether it's this topic or another topic too, I think the thing I try to tell folks, because we're so bombarded with all this information and and we want to do so much so fast, that like, that's actually a really important thing to pay attention to. You actually need to slow down and choose 1 or 2 things at a time to do, as opposed to like everything, right? When I got very ill in 2013, one of my doctors that really made a huge impact on me being able to figure out what was going on. I wasn't exactly sedentary. I was definitely not at a level of fitness that I maintain now, but I would go running 2 or 3 times a week, and I practiced Bikram yoga and all this other stuff. And I just learned Krav Maga, and I was like so excited about that. Because I could yell in public in broad daylight and people would like cheer me on. And I was like, where has this been my whole life? But I got really sick, and there was sort of this chronic exhaustion. And she said to me, as we were figuring out some stuff, she was like, you can't really do anything like that for the next at least 6 months. I was like, excuse me, what? And she's like, yeah, no, you can't. Like, maybe walks like a mile, maybe some hatha yoga, but you really you got to pull back on all that cardio that you're doing. And I was like, are you joking? But my body was in such a state that if I did anything, it would just jack up the cortisol and jack up all these other issues. But then also I'd be exhausted, right? People don't understand chronic fatigue is not a joke. So I used to be able to do that, and then to go and run and take Bikram classes, to do whatever, and then work, 12-hour days and stuff like that for weeks on end. But then all of a sudden I was going running, and it was like I couldn't move for the next 2 days. I could not get off the couch. And I would wake up exhausted for months on end, not just weeks, right? And so, but these are the indicators, right? This is the level where it's like there's something wrong. It did invite my attention to go in other places. So, I ended up spending a lot more time gardening. I did a lot with fiber arts, picked up knitting again, and toy making. It took about almost 2 years. I finally started to feel a little bit better. And then she green lighted me going back and doing stuff. And then I went out and I was like, I'm going to learn Krav Maga. I'm going to learn the most strenuous activity because I finally can do it again. And it was actually really great because part of what we were dealing with was trying to stabilize my metabolic health, right? Because I had a blood sugar issue. I was sitting on the doorstep of diabetes, even though I looked completely like average and normal. Coming into martial arts was in my late 30s of all times, was actually like an extraordinary blessing. We live very disembodied lives. And so I think that goes back though to, how do we actually, instead of focusing on the burnout, how do we actually live this new hybrid life that we can develop for ourselves that is more sustainable? Because that is the gift in all of this, right? We get to make a different choice in how we live our lives intentionally.
So if I hear you or understand you correctly, really, when you're in active burnout, is to step back, to listen to your body, to give your body time to recover versus pounding on more, right? Which is often a tendency in burnout. Oh my God, I'm not doing enough. I need to do more.
You actually need to do less. And I am not a registered dietitian, so please, this is not meant as medical advice. Please listen to your doctor. One thing that was very much my physical health and did make me think about being an embodied creature was, and a huge breakthrough for me was actually taking sugar out of my diet. So I've taken all of refined sugar and most forms of sugar.
What we put in our bodies, it can stress our bodies or it can help us, be in a calmer, more relaxed nervous system state. Yeah.
I was having cognitive issues as part of the issue too, right? And so actually when I made the nutritional shift, that had huge impact on my cognition, and it had huge impact on my ability to have emotional equanimity, which I'd never had before.
One thing, we only have a little bit of time, but I still wanted to touch on it of social connection, support, mirror neurons, working with others, and actually our nervous systems responding to the presence, to the support, to the connection with others. What's the role of that in burnout?
There's so many different interventions that we need to be testing, and we won't ever have like the most pure, perfect protocol. We'll probably have lots of different protocols that are appropriate for different sort of settings. One really cheap, accessible way for people to ease part of the issue around burnout, especially if you have people that you love in your life or you have direct reports or whatever, is conversation. And it sounds so basic. It sounds so utterly basic, but slowing down and having a meaningful conversation, it doesn't have to be a long one. It could be a 15-minute conversation. I think there's something really important about that. And I think it's good to be on video, although there are limitations to that. But I honestly feel like phone conversations or audio-based conversations seem to, this is truly why I feel like podcasts are so popular right now, is that it's somehow the audio experience and hearing another human voice, I think is very steadying and very reassuring. But I think also like spending real time, clock time with someone else matters. And I think if you're in a position of authority, actually listening to those that don't have as much power, giving them the mic or asking them how they're feeling or what they're worried about, and actually really listening to them is an extraordinary way to build trust and I think reduce symptoms of burnout. And again, Dr. Maslach has like six things that she looks for in an organization. If there's misalignment, then there's the high potential for burnout. And 2 of those 6 items are community and a sense of belonging, but also recognition. So, recognition by others in the organization that their work is meaningful, But I think just being able to talk with someone else and listening to them is really important. So, again, as I was developing this class that I'm teaching, it's been extraordinary because as a researcher, I was realizing we actually need to have more of these. Like, I realize I am part of a gigantic long tail, right, of the solution. And this actually is a huge, as many people as possible need to be doing classes, like real-time classes, right? So my class is not, it's parts of it are self-paced and we do use technology, but it is very high touch retail type interaction, right? And this is what I tell my students is like, you have a homework assignment and you have to answer it and you have to send it in, but it's not being registered by a robot. It's being registered by a human being. I'm reading through all of this and I'm writing lengthy replies back because the therapeutic value is in the student and participant seeing that somebody cares. And then, when we get together in classes, that half of the class is devoted to discussion where you're talking it out with someone else. And I do this with actually, and I'm sure, this is absolutely your industry and what you do, right, Katya? But what I found with some of my executive coaching clients is that we have one-on-one conversations during the hour or whatever the setup is, but I assign homework to all of my coaching clients and it's always an audio file. So I give them a prompt and they have to record an audio file and send me the audio file. And there's something about audio, both speaking and listening, the processing is wildly different than if I had them type something out. It's a very different experience. And I really feel like somehow it feels more emotional. Conversation, it sounds so basic, but I really feel like actually some of the technology has caused depersonalization that has led directly to burnout.
Powerful. And what's nice about it is actually simple. We just need to create the framework, right? I could talk to you for hours.
Yes, same.
I want to ask you a sort of question that I ask of everyone. What does it mean to you to befriend your emotions? Why is it important if it is? And what is your favorite tool or your favorite tools and skills to do that?
I would say I have a slightly adversarial relationship with my emotions, if I'm being honest. Dwelling in emotions is actually kind of difficult for me. I think that I've learned to better listen to them as signals. I think also, this is tangential to your question, but I think if there are other people that are watching this that are thinky brained like me and possibly like you, I think this is really important. So one signal of health that has been very interesting in living my life now, where my health condition is sort of stabilized and inflammation is in remission. And a lot of aspects of my life have been reworked. One thing that is interesting is that before I would never think about what my somatic reaction is to something. It was always the brain cognitive reaction, decision-making, like the brain makes the decision, right? Your brain, this gigantic bullying gland inside of our body that thinks that it is running things. It is not running things. It's running things in collaboration with other parts of your body. But one interesting symptom of health is my brain and my body don't always agree. The brain thinks that it's the boss, but it's not. But if the brain and the body disagree, like if something hits me differently in the gut than it might in the head, the body always wins. The body's always right. So if I guess, I don't know if that's emotions necessarily so much as somatic wisdom, but I think of emotions as being more on the somatic side, whereas cognition in the brain is something else, decision-making. So again, it's kind of adversarial, but I listen to the somatic reaction because again, the somatic reaction is almost always right.
And for good reason, right? I mean, some of it is for survival reasons. Tanya, how can get people in touch with you? How do they sign up for courses that you do?
I'd love
How can they follow you on social media?
Oh, all the social medias. Yeah, I'm just at Tanya Tarr on Instagram. I'm also on TikTok at Tanya Tarr, but if you're on Instagram, go with Instagram. By the way, I love TikTok. Because mirror neurons, like we were talking about, I think TikTok is amazing from a mirror neuron perspective. I think that it definitely has the ability to boost really positive brain chemistry. because we're seeing people do all these things, singing, dancing, storytelling, all these things that are aspects of what our ancestors did to build connection and belonging, so I love TikTok. Sorry, that's not the, okay. I'm at Nerdette on Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn. Just look for Tanya Tarr. I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn and on all these different places. I post about our classes. We have a October cohort, and we're going to be doing this in 2022. But it's basically a 4-class series. So basically, they run a month at a time. And connected to that, though, too, I just really feel like we need more things that are designed for the pandemic brain. And so my class is very designed to the pandemic brain. And by that, it's, things are short and punchy. They're not extended. We all just need sort of like really useful things, actionable things, but also at home, in your community, at work. Try to have meaningful conversations with people. And even something like talking about the weather is not trivial. Like, talking about the weather is actually passing a signal back and forth. Are we experiencing the same reality, or how are you experiencing what's going on, and how are you doing? And your ability to actually trade those social amenities signals to someone how open you are to collaborate.
Well, I'll post all that information in the description. Tanya, again, thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.